performance, perfectionism, people pleasing. All of those are survival skills. Reaction leads to survival. The original coping skill gets so integrated into who you are that you believe it is who you are. It's your identity.
I want to talk with you a little bit about your most recent guide because I think it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially with my own job and being in the workplace. For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about how to stop the story that you're telling yourself and get back to the facts of what's going on as the pathway to rewriting your own story. And this week, we're talking about that within the workplace in particular, which is a place where stories are all over the place, as you were talking about. It's not just your family or your relationships, it's also the relationships you carry into the workplace, which I thought was so interesting because I think the workplace is often thought of as this place without that kind of like relationship element or without the personal side. And you're saying no, there is all that in the workplace, just like there is in your family and your relationship. So I'm wondering if maybe you could just talk to me a little bit about what you were thinking when you were writing this.
Sure. So a lot of people believe that the moment that they walk in to the door, and I understand that sometimes it's a metaphorical door, right? Because some people work remotely, but they believe that the moment they're in work mode, that somehow the personal is left at the door and you put on your professional, mask and suit, and you you navigate that space differently. And in reality, that's not true. The moment that we are awake and we're conscious, we are always running stories of some sort. That's just how we operate. That's how we create certainty in our world and how we make sense of what's happening. And it's important for us to have that kind of have meaning, because when we understand something, then for some reason we feel safe, and that's just how we're wired. And so our work environment isn't exempt. I mean, we come into that workspace, and as long as we're awake and we're conscious and we're engaged, we have stories going 24/7, and it's not exempt at work. And so as a matter of fact, sometimes the stories can actually be even more activated because sometimes stakes are higher, because at the end of the day, what we're very concerned about is our image and our identity, and what people think about us and how we're coming across. And so we're already going to be a little bit on high alert. We're trying to manage it. We're trying to manage, what's happening in the room. We're trying to manage how we're navigating what's in the room and how we're reacting to what's in the room.
It may seem a little counterintuitive or unclear why there is this psychologist, trauma expert talking about the workplace. You're not a business person yourself, although you have a business, you've had a business for 30 years, but your background isn't in, business school or business education.
We have this really weird idea that somehow we have these separate selves, right? That, we show up for work and we put on our professional self, and somehow our professional self is separate from our personal self. And I believe that professional is personal, because at the end of the day, we're bringing ourselves into that room. Whether it's a room with a partner, a room with a family member, a room with a friend, a room with a neighbor, or a room with a boss or a colleague, we're still bringing our personal selves in that room. Now, we may operate with the rules that we've learned in professional settings, but it doesn't keep us from showing up as our personal selves. And so we can't stop being who we are. As long as a person is in the room, then I do have a say, because it's about psychology, and it's about psyche, and it's about navigating, and it's about coping, and it's about survival skills.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I am constantly navigating that, at least in the workplace myself. I think you and I are maybe in slightly different positions, and I mean, to start off with, our jobs are different. The amount of years we've been in the workplace is different. The types of roles that we have are different. But I think, especially with previous roles I've been in, I've really felt those dynamics at play. I remember one of my first jobs I had when I got out of college was at this really cutthroat agency, and it was just so intense. Like, I was working for this boss that was really brutal, and there was like really high stakes all the time, and the emotions ran really high. There was a lot of other things that should not be happening in a workplace, which I won't go too deep into, but just I'll just say that there was a lot going on. And I just felt it. Like, I was in this job probably about 5 or 6 months in, and I just felt terrible. Like, I would wake up every day, and the first thought I had was just like the pure terror about the job. And, every text message that came through was just like a huge wave of anxiety. Like, oh no, what am I going to do now? Like, what did I do? How did I mess up? And I feel like that's definitely a more extreme example, but I can definitely see the ways in which these really human emotions make their way into the workplace. And I can also see the way in which those human emotions are what make work either really great or really difficult.
What you're sharing with me is in this work environment, you're actually having a trauma response. You're having a response. Your system is going, okay, there is something very scary and very threatening about this place that I'm in. And you're going to go into survival mode. And survival mode is not just a biological experience, it is an emotional experience, it's a psychological experience. And sometimes we're disconnected from our stories, like we're not conscious of our stories, but it doesn't mean the stories aren't running. They're running in the background in the subconscious, and our bodies are responding those to those stories. So when you talk about waking up in the first thing in the morning, you feel that sense of terror. Well, that terror not only is in your body and you feel it literally biologically and in sensations, but usually what's going to follow that is you're going to tell yourself something. Like you're going to say, oh my God, I don't want to go to work. I hate this place. You may even say to yourself, it makes me sick. I'm always in trouble. Or what did I do wrong? I'm always in trouble. You start this like inner monologue of stories that actually reinforce the biological response to threat.
Mhm.
And so I think it's a great example because more often than not, people will talk about their challenging experiences at work. And really what it boils down to is it's people oftentimes. It's not the work itself. It may not be the tasks, although sometimes tasks are stressful. What it often comes down to is when you hear people talk about their work experiences and they talk about the contrast between having a positive work experience and having a negative work experience, I will tell you 9 times out of 10 it's boiling down to human interaction. And what's happening in that human interaction, whether it's a hierarchical thing where a boss with a subordinate, they're engaging in interactions that are activating old threat systems, and it could come in from either direction. You can have bosses. I mean, I've been in situations, as a matter of fact, before I went into private practice and become an entrepreneur and owned my own business, I worked in systems as well. My first job after getting my PhD, I worked in a university setting. And
Mm.
I worked in a small department, and I worked in a research center. And what I was really struck by is I would often talk about, okay, there's too many egos in the room. And I didn't mean people with big heads. What I meant was the interactions. There was a tension in the room. There, you could tell that people were kind of, the hairs were on the back of the neck, and they were, I call it posturing, like they're bracing and they're waiting for some fight. It was a very uncomfortable situation. And what was fascinating about it is that people were interacting without ever naming it. Like they weren't consciously saying, hey, I feel threatened by this, or hey, this is bringing up something, or it's triggering me. No, they were just acting as it were
Mm.
happening. And so I see that happen often. And a lot of times people will leave a job because the activation is too much, because the threat, the constant threat, the anxiety, the stomach aches, the headaches, the tension, it's too much, and they leave. And what they don't realize is that they're in a chronic state of activation, and along with that activation is some storyline that says I'm not safe. And it happens more frequently in the work setting than people are probably willing to admit.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's something that you said that I want to go back on because I wonder if you could give a little more information about that. You had said that oftentimes we are like reenacting old scripts when we're in the
Mhm,
workplace, or
mhm.
taking things that are maybe not based on what happened in the workplace and bringing them into the workplace. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more and like what that looks like.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. This is a great example. It's actually a client of mine, and the reason he came to see me. So he had come to see me. His father had just recently passed, so it was probably a matter of 2 or 3 months between his father passing and my seeing him. And he was struggling at work, and he actually went out on leave. And as I worked with this client, what we came to, and I think this is a great example of how old scripts play out, is he would get really triggered by his boss, his new boss. And as we started investigating what was going on for him and we kind of approached it from a place of curiosity, what we realized was that his boss actually had some behavioral characteristics that were exactly like his father.
Hmm.
Now, he did not make that conscious connection, and by the way, my client came from a home where there was trauma. His father was very abusive. His father was physically abusive, emotionally abusive. And so my client had experienced a lot of trauma. And it's really common for me, especially with men. They'll come in to see me and they have no idea. Like they are so disconnected from themselves that they're not coming in and telling me, oh, Dr. Ariano, I have trauma. No, not at all. What they're coming in saying is, oh my God, I'm having panic attacks, or my heart is beating through my chest, or I can't find words, or for some reason I'm tearing up. And so with this client of mine, that's exactly what was happening. He was having panic attacks in the office. He was tearing up. He didn't understand it. And once we were able to identify what was going on, then we started identifying the stories that he was telling himself. So basically, I mean, I'm not saying literally, but to some degree, what it was doing is it was pulling him back to his child self. So, what was happening inside of his head, in his mind, was the experience of being abused by his father, especially emotionally. That script was being activated. So, when he was in an interaction with his boss, it wasn't the adult client that was talking to his boss, it was the child that was kind of front stage and center. And that's who was experiencing this. And unfortunately, in this particular situation, my client couldn't go back. He could not return to work. He could not overcome the activation that this old script was creating in him. So that's a great example. I mean, I think it's a perfect example of how old scripts can come into the work environment. And sometimes you can relate to a boss, oftentimes like a parent or perhaps a perpetrator, and it can activate a script that it feels as if the old event or events are actually happening in the present moment. Now, consciously, logically, we're like, no, that's not this. It's not. That's crazy. But it doesn't matter. We have an emotional self that does not have a concept of present or past or time. So it is happening for that emotional self in the present moment.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, just hearing that makes me think about that obviously really bad job I had. And since then, I've had a few other jobs. And I was in one of my more recent jobs and I had messed up a few times. Something had gone wrong. And I just like went into this like storm of apologies. Like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Like, I'm trying to figure this out. Like, and that was the response I had learned from that previous job where I would often get yelled at or some other punishment would happen to me or like things would just get so bad when I messed up. And so many like my new manager had said, like, why are you apologizing like this? Like, why are you freaking out? Like, it's okay. These things happen. And it was like, whoa, like this is what a manager could be like for me, like in that moment. I think it wasn't very helpful that that bad job was my first job out of college. So it kind of like set the bar of like what felt normal. I've been talking a lot about perfectionism with my friends and my therapist as well. And I think, perfectionism follows me everywhere. I think, it's following me in my personal work and my job and my relationships. And I think I'm sometimes get really stuck with it, especially in my job now, where I'm just trying so hard to be perfect. And sometimes that'll stop me from turning in something on time or um, talking to a coworker in a certain way. And I think I'm trying to think about how to overcome those feelings. And as I'm working through those, it's like, oh wow, this isn't just about the workplace. This is also about the perfectionism I learned growing up. And, the need to be perfect came from, a need to be acceptable or like respected and accepted by society. And I feel like, yeah, that's just something that's coming up for me now is just something as small as perfectionism, which feels like it could be a benefit or a asset for someone in the workplace, can also be maybe its own kind of trauma response. Um, Maybe it's almost like saying like the story in my head is thinking that like I'm not enough or like I'm not good
Mhm.
enough, so I need to keep working to prove that I am. I'm not sure what to do with that, but that's kind of what's coming up for me.
No, I think that's exactly true. And what we don't realize is that we can have tendencies. Like for example, one of the things that I often say to my clients is I say to them, "You're in survival mode if you are exhibiting any of the P's." I call them the P's, right? You're trying to prove yourself.
Hmm.
There's a performance, there's perfectionism, or there's people pleasing. All of those are survival skills. And I guarantee you, if I were to push, whether if I were to talk to you about it or if I were to talk to my client about it, or quite frankly, I'm going to be really transparent here. I know that I'm just as human as everybody else, and I have these survival tendencies as well. That if I were to push or challenge, let's talk about this. Like let's talk about where this skill came from, this survival skill. And oftentimes they can get to what we'll call an original trauma. Again, I've talked about traumas. I've talked about little t traumas and big T traumas. Trauma's trauma. And a lot of times they can go directly to the original wound, the original experience. Like for example, oftentimes I see with perfectionism, there's the fear of humiliation. There's a fear of not being accepted, about being ejected, voted off the island, so to speak. And they can talk about an experience like in childhood. They can talk about a very traumatic thing that might have happened in a peer group or on the playground or in high school where they were made fun of. And so they can often go directly to that beeline to the original trauma, and they can talk about how these skills or these survival strategies kind of developed and were built and kind of almost calcified over time. Because here's the crazy part: these skills, they can actually get you somewhere in life. They can really advance you and create forward movement and actually be at the core of your success. And so because of that, they can be reinforcing. Yet at the same time, and I'm sure you can probably attest to this, I can attest to this as I call a recovering perfectionist. It's also a prison. I mean, it holds you back. It creates a lot of stress. It creates a lot of angst. It creates a lot of anxiety. And so the thing that actually helps us survive ends up hurting us, is what usually typically happens.
That's interesting because I feel like this is everything that I'm living through right now. So I'm glad we're able to be talking about it together. And, I definitely want to hear a little bit more about what this experience has been like for you, navigating your own perfectionism throughout your whole life. And, because I think something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is, tracing back that perfectionism to that original trauma you said, or, kind of following the story back to its source. And I think I think about myself a lot as like a younger person, as a younger child, and I've kind of been a perfectionist throughout my whole life, and I think a lot of it came from, I had this skill to be quote unquote perfect at, school or projects I was working on. Not never like really sports. I feel like sports wasn't ever really my thing. But I knew my things, and if I worked really hard, I could be very good at it, which was a skill to be sure. But I think a lot of it came from a sense of, like, alienation, like you had talked about, or being different, or, needing to prove my value, I think, in some ways, I think especially growing up in the place that I did, I felt so different for most of my life, and I think that's often the experience of being a first, like we've been talking about on this show, is, you're often the first in a room, or you're the only person there, and that was so often the case for me growing up. Like, I was often the only brown kid, and I was oftentimes, like, people, like, assumed I was gay, and that was just such a big part of my childhood, I think, and so being a perfectionist in something like school, I think, was the way for me to combat that. Like, you're not gonna think of me as this gay Latino kid, even though that's who I was and am now. But, like, you're gonna think of me as this really smart person, or this, like, really competent person. And so I think that that definitely became my defense mechanism that I'm still trying to unravel as it's coming into, like, the workplace and my relationships. Like, it's gotten me really far in life, and at the same time, it also feels like that prison, like you've talked about. And I'm curious if maybe you could talk about what that's been like for you, because I know just from conversations that you have also had a very similar experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about my own journey, and I think it's important for me to share my journey because, I will say, Esteban, that when I think about my own wisdom and I think about the things that I'm sharing today, I'm sharing these as a professional, but I'm also sharing them from a person with lived experience. Like I went through my own journey. Again, we've talked about the fact that I came from a background there was a lot of trauma in my background. There was a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability, chaos. I didn't feel protected. I didn't feel safe. There was emotional abuse, physical abuse. I look at the way my own healing has unfolded. And in the beginning, I was unconscious, like I just was unaware. I was just doing these things, and these things got me somewhere. So they were reinforcing. And so, like you, I also had the perfectionism. And I think the perfectionism started really early. And I think the perfectionism for me was born out of my trying to avoid my father's rages or being the target of his rages. And so if I was good, if I was perfect, if I didn't make any waves, if I did well all the time, then I would avoid the abuse. And I think that's where it started. And then what ends up happening, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, is the original coping skill gets so integrated into who you are that you believe it is who you are. It's your identity when it really isn't, but it feels like it because it's so integrated in the way that you navigate, you kind of move through the world. And so you end up being in this place where it feels kind of like a double-edged sword. And let me tell you what I mean by that. The part of you that is built in to protect you is holding on like a death grip to this strategy. So we'll talk about perfectionism. That part of you that's holding on to that, like, oh my God, you can't let this go, because if you let this go, what could happen? You could, nobody's gonna like you, or everybody's gonna see that you're flawed, and they're gonna make fun of you, or they're gonna judge you, or they're not gonna want to be your friend. So that part of your mind is going, I'm not letting go of this. Hell no. But then you have this other part of you that's going, oh my God, this is really hard. Like I can't keep up with this. It's unsustainable. I'm killing myself. People, perfectionism is a really big deal. And some people are actually looking at perfectionism as a disorder because of what it does to our well-being. It really impacts our well-being in a very negative way. Um, and so, I think for me, as I look at my own journey and I look at how, I confronted my own survival patterns, because I would say I was definitely a perfectionist. I would definitely say that I was a people pleaser. It was hard for me to say no. I didn't want to not be liked. The proving, I was always proving myself. I was very hard on myself about having to prove just how good I was, that I was enough, I was smart enough, I was, kind enough, I was whatever enough. And those patterns can really take hold and really be very difficult to shift.
Definitely, and As always, I think it's interesting just how similar you and I are on in this area. I think
Mhm.
we've had very different lives, and yet we have also developed very similar strategies to navigating this life. And I think it's not something that's just, like, special to you and me. I think that this is something that's often very common for people in our position, for, like, the firsts, as, we've been talking about on this show, and I'm curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about why you think it is that people like the firsts have turned to these strategies that on the surface may seem good or neutral or not that big of a deal, and why it's important to actually pay attention to where this comes from.
When we're talking about the first, we're really talking about an individual who's experiencing something, for the first time, and it may be for themselves or for their family. Like, I'll use myself as an example. I'm a first in a lot of different ways. So I'm a first because I was the first person in my family to go to college. I'm a first because I was the first person to get a graduate degree in my family. I'm a first because statistically speaking, when you look at how many Latinas are PhDs, of all the PhDs in the United States, less than 1% are Latinas. So I'm a first in that regard. You're a first when you're in spaces where you're the only one like yourself that's in that space. So you can be in professional spaces, like for example, you could be a Latina in an engineering spaces that are generally predominated by white cisgender, often middle-aged men, or in architecture, for example, or in the tech world. And so anytime you're a first, you're the person that stands out in the room as being different. And so differences can come from different things. So differences can come from skin color, or ethnicity or race. It can also come from gender identification. It can come from um, sexual orientation. It could come from religious differences. It can actually come from being neurodivergent. And when we talk about neurodivergence, we're talking about different kinds of minds. And so, what kinds of minds? It can be people that are really gifted, exceptionally gifted. It makes them very different, and it makes it difficult for them to relate to people that are not like them, or people that are on the spectrum of autism, or even other kinds of differences, learning disabilities, or ADHD. Our minds are different. And so anytime we're in settings where we stand out, like we are the only one, that would constitute being a first. Sometimes firsts are pattern breakers. Like for example, in my family, when I look at my family, I see myself as a first in terms of breaking the cycle, and breaking the cycle of abuse. And that's also an experience of the first. Now, when we are a first, part of the terrain of being a first is that you're in an unfamiliar setting with people that are unlike you. This is really important because think about the setup. First of all, you're in an unfamiliar setting. You don't understand the rules. You don't understand the expectations. You don't understand what is supposed to happen. You don't have previous experiences that set you up for this room. So there's that. So the unfamiliarity and uncertainty. The other part of it is you are different. So you are an other. And so those two circumstances are immediately, just by default, they are going to set up the threat system in your mind. So just being in that space is automatically going to activate, I'm not safe. I'm not safe. I'm not safe. Now, if you're not consciously aware of that, if you're not challenging that with logic, then what's going to happen is you're going to act that out through survival patterns. And there's different kinds of things. When we look at our survival system, we basically have four options. We have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So what do those exactly mean? Fight can be different things. Here's something interesting that people don't realize is that, pushing, 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 proving, 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 doing is actually a fight response. Okay,
Hmm.
now there's other types of fight responses. Fight responses are challenges, conflict, getting in people's faces, being big, Those are fight responses. It's a way that we protect ourselves. We have a freeze response. Freeze responses are shutting down. So when you play small in a room, when you shrink, when you don't talk when you really want to, when you try to blend into the woodwork, that is a freeze response. You don't do anything, you disengage. Now, fawning, a form of fawning is people pleasing. It's appeasement. It's trying to make the situation go away that you're uncomfortable with by doing what you think people want you to do. So it could be performing. You're acting a way that isn't really congruent with what you're feeling. You may say yes when you really want to say no, and so that's a fawning response. And then so we have fight, flight. Flight is just checking out. So checking out could be something like you're sitting in a room, but you're not there. You're somewhere else. You're on a beach, you're on a beach in Jamaica, or you're thinking about what happened this morning before you came into this meeting. So we're going to do one of those things. So being a first is almost setting you up for that. And so if you don't have the awareness, you're going to go right into those survival patterns just by default.
So, I think it's oftentimes, I love this idea of the fight, flight, fawn, and what's the last one?
Freeze,
Freeze, thank
freeze.
you, freeze,
Yes.
yeah. I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. We have been talking about that, but I'm curious, I think it can be really hard to identify, for example, that like, oh, I'm in freeze mode right now, or I'm in fight mode. Those feel like more abstract concepts. And so I'm curious if maybe you could talk about maybe more surface level ways that you can tell maybe I'm acting out because I'm doing one of these things right now. Like, I feel like maybe we've talked about perfectionism being its own form of that. Maybe it's a little bit of the fight mechanism where like constantly proving again and again just how capable I am. But I'm wondering if we could talk about some of the other ways in which you can start to identify whether you're a first or not, or you're just having issues in the workplace. Like, okay, something is happening when I'm living in a story right now. Like, what are some of those things as they show up in the workplace that we could start to indicate that we're in that place?
Absolutely. And I think what could be really helpful, Esteban, is, to really understand that we might be in that place. A lot of times our body tells us. Our body tells us before anything else. And so, for example, if you're in a professional space and you're feeling threatened, you're feeling unsafe, the flight is fuck it. So I get a lot of clients that we talk about the case of the fuck it's. You get to the point where you're like, fuck this shit, I'm out. That is a flight response.
Mm.
Okay. I don't want to do this. Sometimes you literally feel like you want to go. You're going to say things to yourself like, I can't do this. I can't do it. I can't do it. I got to get out of here. And that's kind of what's happening. And you actually feel your body like you just want to leave is what's happening. With a freeze response, there's a complete shutdown. Like sometimes you can't even tell yourself what you're feeling. Like it's almost like you're without emotion, you're without thought, you can't think. That is a freeze response. And so you'll see people, or you'll have the experience of I'm just not present, like I'm not even there, like I'm not thinking, I'm not feeling, I'm not in my body, I can't feel anything. There's just a complete lights are out kind of thing. A fawn response in a work environment can be things like you said, apologizing all the time is a fawn response. Oh my god, I did something wrong, I've got to fix this. I'm so sorry, what can I do? That is a fawn response. Or
Mm.
you just want your boss to stop lecturing at you, you're in trouble and you just want them to shut up, and all you're doing is going, uh-huh, yeah, that's right. I agree. I agree. Because you just want it to stop. That's a fawn response.
Hmm. Wow. I feel like I'm guilty of doing all those things at some point in the workplace.
We all are. We all are. Typically, we have one or two favorites.
Mhm.
We're often wired that way, where we'll have a default. But most of us will jump through all of them at different times, because sometimes it's actually a pretty cool system when you really think about it. And given the situation, you're going to automatically go, which one of these survival patterns is going to make the most sense? You're probably not going to get in your boss's face, right? You're probably not going to get into a fight response with your boss, although some people do, and it doesn't end up well for them, right? And so what you might want to, in that situation, if your tendency is to fight, you may go, no, I'm not going to do that because I know that that's not going to work well for me. And you might go into another survival pattern that isn't typical for you, but makes a lot more sense given the situation.
So I'm curious with all that, we're talking about ways to identify how you might be surviving in the workplace, which I think so many of us are doing, especially just like in this current age where it's just like the workplace, the work the job market is terrible. And sometimes you have to stay in a job because you don't want to lose your salary. And for those of us that are in that survival mode at work, I kind of want to talk now about how do we move from survival in the workplace to something better? Maybe to thriving in the workplace or feeling like you can be your best self, they're your most full self and do your best work and feel fulfilled. All that is a really big pie in the sky dream of what work can be. And maybe work will never be that for most of us, and that's okay. But I'm curious, like, what are the steps we can begin to take to jump out of that survival mode into something better in the workplace?
That's a great question. It starts first with even being aware that you're in a story. Because if you don't have that awareness, there's nothing that you can address. You can't make an empowered choice without the awareness. And so for some people, the awareness starts because their body is communicating to them. So for example, some people are aware of their story right away and some people aren't. But what they'll notice is their body's doing something, whether your heart is racing or you're sweating or you feel like you're going to cry, you got the lump in your throat or you're feeling sick to your stomach or you feel rigid. A lot of times your body's going to be the first sign. And so key into that. The moment you start to feel those things, then what you do is you ask yourself the question, what am I telling myself right now in this moment? What is the story that I'm telling myself? So once you're able to do that and you can identify the decision or excuse me, the story, you can identify the story. This is where you go from surviving to thriving. You recognize the story. You ask yourself the question, first of all, can I prove that this is actually true? Okay, so we get into the fact versus fiction kind of conversation. The second question to ask is this serving me right now? Like, is this helping me or is this harming me? And so when you're able to have the awareness and consciousness to ask yourself the question, is this harming or helping? Then you can go into empowered choice. Empowered choice is, I understand that I'm having this response. I know where it comes from. It makes sense to me that this is what I do. And I also recognize right now in this moment what is happening right in front of me. It's not helping me. And so I am going to take a chance and I'm going to choose something else. The moment you get into choice, that is the first step into thriving. The more you build on that, empowered choice leads to thriving. Reaction leads to survival.
Whoa. I'm just like wrapping my mind around that. Like, can you like say that again? Maybe just expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. So when you are in a place of choice, so if we think about this, we have a couple of options. No matter what, we're going to react or respond. We are wired to take care of ourselves. So we can come from a place of survival. The place of survival is going to be reactive. It's going to be a default. There's not going to be a lot of thought put in it. It's going to be that knee jerk reaction. When we're able to stop ourselves, and sometimes we can stop ourselves because we're recognizing something in our body, and we can ask ourselves, what am I telling myself right now? The moment you do that, the moment you say that to yourself, you're opening the door to choice. Choice is, this is what I'm doing right now. I understand why I'm doing it. I know where it comes from. And in this moment, do I want to choose this? Is this helpful to respond or react this way? Or is this hurting me? And in that moment, the moment that you do that, you have just opened the door into thriving because it's an empowered choice. You're making a purposeful decision about what is best for you.
Hmm. I I l I love that, and I'm wondering if maybe we can apply that to, say my first really bad job. There was this one time, just trying to think of the many situations where I was just in such a difficult, like, shitty position, like,
Mhm.
maybe one was, I was responsible for booking my boss's, travel, and
Mhm.
she was such a princess, she always loved to travel first class. And one time I had booked her a business class ticket and she called and just like screamed at me because she's like, "How could you book me on business class? I only fly first class. Like, this. They're different, blah, blah, blah." I think like at the time I was just so annoyed and mad because I was also making minimum wage in Los Angeles and I was barely able to afford my life, let alone a first class ticket versus a business class ticket. So I know this is a very ridiculous situation that I nevertheless was in, but I'm curious if, maybe if I were to go back, like how could I apply this to feel like, okay, I'm not just surviving this job, I'm not just trying to, make it one more day through this wrath, but I'm actually starting to feel like I can make a choice instead. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Absolutely. I think it's a great example. So, you know, and it's interesting to hear you talk about this because I think there's another part of your mind that's trying to protect you, and it's trying to protect you by you being annoyed. So
Mhm.
annoyed is a by the way is a fight response. I just want to let you know. So you may have been trying to manage the discomfort of being yelled at by being annoyed because it could kind of offload that threat response because annoyance is a fight response. So let's go back to that. What could that look like? Like, what would have been an empowered, thriving choice? In that moment, you would have gone, okay, I'm activated right now. Like her yelling at me, I'm feeling very threatened. So you would recognize that. Okay. And I'm recognizing that I am reacting to her yelling at me by having this response of annoyance or agitation or maybe anxiety. Okay. I'm recognizing that. So I'm in that fight response. Is this serving me in the moment? Well, no, because I'm allowing this to happen. This woman is yelling at me. She's being abusive. I'm not okay with this. But right now I'm caught up in my survival pattern. So what you do is you go, okay, does it, is it serving me in this moment to be annoyed? Well, what serves you in that moment to be able to ask yourself, what is it that I need to do to take care of myself? Well, it may be that you need to say to her, "Hey, this isn't okay with me. You can talk to me calmly, and I'm happy to work this out. I'm sorry. This was a misunderstanding, and I'm willing to do this, but I'm not going to allow you to yell at me. It's inappropriate and it's unacceptable." So when you're able to get out of that original survival pattern, then you can go down that road of being able to consciously choose what's best for you. Now, if you didn't and you got into the default survival pattern, it could have been a number of things. You could have apologized profusely. You could have been agitated and annoyed. You could have experienced anxiety. You could have done everything you possibly could to just get her off the phone. Those would have been survival patterns. And at the end of the day, you might have been upset with yourself because there's a sense of self-betrayal in that because you're not taking care of yourself. So that's the difference between survival and empowered choice down the road of thriving.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I was also, you had start out by saying that annoyance is a fight like is a fight response in and of itself, which to me just felt like a mind blowing moment. Just because I think to me, and maybe this goes back to the difference between stories and facts, like, to me, annoyance just feels like a natural response to something that's, like, objectively bad, and I think it's interesting
Mhm,
to hear that when I'm annoyed at work for my boss acting out or, this coworker's getting on my nerves like that, oftentimes I'm still in that survival mode, basically.
mhm. Yeah. Well, and also I want to make it clear too, because you could be in a survival pattern and it can also be a signal of something that needs to be taken care of. When we are in annoyance or anger, annoyance is a form of anger, right? You got frustration, annoyance, anger. They're kind of in the same continuum. Um, what that's saying is that something is happening is not okay. There is some kind of violation. All right. Now, what you could do is you have a violation. You could get into survival pattern. Survival pattern is just following through with that and being unconscious with it, just being annoyed, maybe fighting back, maybe saying something smartass to her, something like that. That would be the ongoing survival pattern, right? Or you could go in that moment and go, I'm annoyed. Um, what's going on for me? And sometimes what it is, it's about taking care of yourself and setting a boundary. And just confronting the possibility of needing to set a boundary could actually cause a survival pattern because it makes people uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, I feel that. Yeah, that makes sense. And I wanna just maybe situate this conversation we're having today within like the broader theme that we've been talking about this month. We have been, as part of this own your story journey, this month we've been talking about how to stop the story and like how to recognize that you're living in a story to begin to take the next steps towards having a more empowered response to what's happening to you or your surroundings. And I think that, we started this conversation being like, well, why the workplace? Why are we looking at the workplace? Because so many of our conversations up to this point have been about other things. Like it has been about our relationships or our friendships or our home life. And what I'm gathering from you we're talking about today is, that the workplace is just another set of relationships that you're living in. They might be different than your partner or your parent or your kid or your friend, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And if we're able to recognize that that relationship in the workplace is dictated by stories just like any other relationship, well, that might describe some of the suffering or survival that we're going through. And it also, once we're able to acknowledge that, might lead us towards the path of a better existence or a better relationship to the people around us and the work that we're doing. I'm curious, just as we're closing out, if you could speak a little bit about what this place of empowerment looks like. You've always kind of talked about this empowerment zone or this place of power. And I'm curious, in the context of the workplace, if we are willing and able to start doing this work, what could work look like for us? Or what could the workplace look like for us once we begin this journey?
I often think about life as having contrast, right? Like we kind of have the yin and the yang or the black and the white. We have contrast, and sometimes having contrast is helpful to learn, especially when we're learning new things. And so when we think about the work environment, I think the mistake that people make is that, they say this is professional and this is personal, and it's a bunch of BS. It is personal because it deals with people. So it's going to be personal. Now, what can happen is that people can act out. They can act out. And when I say act out, what I'm saying is they're acting out their script. They are an actor in their story and they're acting out as if their story is true. And I'm sure that everybody that listens to this, and you and I can talk about this as well, that we have been in situations, whether they're work situations or otherwise, where people are acting out their script. Now, you may not know their script, but they're acting out. Now, that's the contrast. Now, if we're talking about the opposite of acting out, we're talking about being present and empowered. Empowered really just is, it's as simple as boiling down to choice. I am choosing something. And instead of allowing something to just happen by default, I am actually choosing. And so you can be in a work environment, as long as you're working with people, it is personal. And I think, when I think about, we started our conversation off today, Esteban, with this idea of why me? Why am I talking about this? I don't have a business background. I don't have an organizational psychology degree. I am a psychologist. I'm a coach. I'm a trauma expert. I'm a relationship expert. So why me talk about this? Because I talk about people and persons and personalities and, trauma. And as long as there's an environment that has people in it, then it is personal. And we are going to have opportunities to act out our scripts, or we have opportunities to recognize that our script is activated, and we can pause and we can say, up, this is activated. And my natural or my default response is to do A. And I recognize that that is just not going to help me. It's not going to get me to where I want to be. And so in that moment, you're allowing that to go. You're letting go of the default and actually choosing something that serves you. That is really at the core of empowerment.
Wow, letting go of the default and choosing something that empowers you, is that kind of what I'm taking away from this conversation?
Mhm.
That it
Mhm.
applies to work, it applies to our relationships, our friendships, whatever it may be, and that doing that work is the road to living a more empowered life, is what it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. And it starts with just being present and aware to what's going on. It's that simple. I think people get really overwhelmed by, you know, I'm using language that we don't use in everyday world. I'm talking about terms. We've all been in experiences where we can feel very overwhelmed with what's happening inside of us, in terms of what we're telling ourselves, in terms of the emotion, in terms of the sensation in our bodies. And what I want the listeners to hear is, the moment you pause, just the moment you pause, you can have all kinds of shit happening. And all you have to do is go, I'm just going to take a deep breath and just pause for a moment, and I'm going to take inventory. What is happening? I'm shaking. I'm terrified. I'm in a panic. Well, why am I in a panic? What am I telling myself? Well, I'm telling myself I might lose my job. Well, okay, is that really true? Are you going to lose your job? Well, I don't know that for sure. Okay, when I think I'm going to lose that job, this is what happens and this is how I act. Is this helpful? No, it's not helpful. It's not going to keep me from losing my job. And so having that awareness, that is a simple skill that you can cultivate. And it starts with a pause. That's what it all it is a pause. And that can take you so far. And that pause is the fork in the road. The pause is, am I going to go down default, which is my animal brain, trying to protect me with my four options, fight, flee, freeze, or fawn? Or am I going to be more empowered and more creative with my options here? And I have to have the pause to stop the default, just to put that on pause.
To stop the story, basically.
Basically, yeah. And so I think what's really important about the conversation that we didn't get to, Esteban, is when I talk about owning your story, it is layered. There's layers to this. We can look at the microcosm, we can look at the moment to moment. We can't change something we don't own. We have to own it first. We have to say, yes, this is what's happening to me. That's about owning your story. Okay. Then you get to stop the story. You get to say, does this story work for me? Is it getting me what I need or want? Is it taking me in the direction of where I want to go? If the answer is no, drop the story. Just drop it. This doesn't serve me anymore. What do you do instead? You think about, well, what is it that I need? What is it that I want? Where do I want to go? How do I get there? You can't do that when you're in that activated reactive state.
Wow, I feel like we've covered so much ground here, and I feel like we could keep having this conversation for much longer, but it's a good thing that we have one every single week coming out, because I'm
Yeah,
excited to
there's a
get more into the owning the story part, and then also thinking about how you drop the story, because that, maybe I can acknowledge that the stories are happening, but dropping it feels like way above my pay grade. So I'm excited to like chat with you more about that in the next couple weeks.
Yes, we can talk about that. It does get a little sticky when we think about stopping the story, especially when we believe our survival is dependent on it. We're afraid to
Mm.
let that go. Yep.
Well, I'm excited to get into it, but as always, I've just really enjoyed this conversation with you. I think for me, I'm just walking away with the ideas that work is made up of relationships, just like any other place in your life where there are people. And oftentimes we are acting out on this default script that we have acquired over our lifetime through big T or little t traumas. It could be the way we're meant to be perfectionistic or avoidant or appeasing our bosses. But living with these stories or acting out these stories is really just a default pattern that can either serve us or it might just be something that's entrapping us. And if we want to work towards something more satisfying at work, we need to be willing to take that pause, let the story go, and start to get a little more creative about the choices we make going forward. Does that sound about
Right.
right?
It absolutely, absolutely, and it really comes down to, do you wanna be in survival mode all the time, which is basic bare minimum bones, here, or do you wanna thrive? Do you wanna feel satiated and happy and fulfilled and, have a life of joy and purpose? It's hard to have those things if you're in survival mode all the time. Those are almost mutually exclusive.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like you give me a lot to think about, and hopefully everyone listening to this too as well. If you're listening, this is the third part of our 12-week Own Your Story journey. Every single week, we're going to be talking about a new topic within the realm of owning your story and making the life that you want for yourself. For these first 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about how to stop the story. And then going forward from here, we're going to talk about how to own your story, how to drop it, and then how to rewrite your story to live a more fulfilled, empowered life. If you liked what you listened to today, feel free to drop a comment below, subscribe, head to the email list at the link in our bio to be able to sign up for these weekly emails yourself. And we'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.